Let's talk politics with the co-leader of the Green Party, Russel Norman, with us this morning. Morning, Russell.
Morning, Waymo.
Morning, Russell. And you went for a wee helicopter ride over the top of the wreck that is Rena the other day. What did you see?
Well, it's there's kind of a bit of an oil slick around the boat, and even on normal days, and then there's the Awanuia attached to it, trying to get the oil off, and then there's another tug holding the Awanuia in place, and of course the Rena has got massive cracks all down the sides, and looks in really bad shape.
So they seem to be making a bit of progress now, though, don't they?
Yeah, they seem to be. It's incredibly difficult. Once the oil cooled, it's very, very difficult to get it off. So part of the problem is, of course, obviously, once they got to that point, then it really slowed things down.
But things are speeding up. So once they get all that oil off, I guess the next thing they'll need to tackle is the containers. Any word from the authorities on how they're going to do that?
Well, they're trying to use cranes. I mean, the problem is you've got to come at it from the high side of the boat, so you don't get containers falling on top of you, which means that it's quite hard to get cranes that are stable enough to get over that. A crane on a barge. So it is a bit challenging.
Okay, well, on to an issue just before the Rugby World Cup. It was released by the government on Friday, the Defence Force report into SAS complicity in torture. They say that the New Zealand Defence Force has had no idea about any sort of torture, and we certainly didn't hand over any prisoners for torture. What do you make of the report?
It's actually a trick. So what happens is the New Zealand Defence Forces work alongside the Afghan ones, and so they've been very actively involved in capturing people. But then when it comes to time to sign the piece of paper, even if there's only one Afghan soldier there, they sign the piece of paper, even though it might have been the New Zealanders that actually did the capturing. So then New Zealand can say, oh, nothing to do with us. Okay,
so you think it's a bit of a cover-up?
It's a trick. I mean, it's so that they can say we're not responsible for it, someone else is. Even though they captured lots and lots of people and handed them over to the Afghans to be tortured, they can say no, it was the Afghan soldier amongst us who signed the form. Therefore, the person didn't go into New Zealand custody. They went into Afghan custody, and so we're not responsible. The Afghans are.
What do you make of Labour's policy released yesterday saying they will pull the SAS 90 days after the election, within 90 days, a full 4 days before National are promising to pull them out?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Labor put them in there in the first place. People may recall the whole split in the alliance back in the early 2000s was over this question because Labor was so gung-ho to get into Afghanistan. So, it's good that they're getting them out or at least saying they're going to get them out when they're in opposition.
Okay, what about the pre-election economic and fiscal update yesterday? Things aren't so rosy, but the government reckons they'll have things in surplus by 2015. Do you believe them?
They're pretty hopeful projections. I mean, the thing that hasn't been communicated, we tried to communicate it yesterday in our press release, but it just hasn't got through, is that the government's in cash deficits well after June 2016, so actually beyond any of the projection period from Treasury, the cash deficits remain. The reason why they're able to say that they go into surplus by the end of June, by June 2015, is because they say they get the profits from the state-owned enterprises, but a lot of those profits are retained by the state-owned enterprises, so the money never gets to the government. And so the government actually has a cash deficit, which means it's still borrowing. So even right through the very end of the projection, the government is still increasing its borrowing. But yeah, that message, I'm afraid, got lost in the government spin that they've got surplus.
They've, of course, failed to make the hard decisions at the beginning of the term, and now they're saying if they get in next time, then there will be, extreme cuts, austerity measures, I suppose you could call them. I mean, if you guys have a say in government, would you also be looking for cuts as well? I mean, cuts have to come somewhere, surely.
Well, I mean, balancing the books is you've got to look at revenue and you've got to look at expenditure. So on the expenditure side, the government has a really profligate series of motorways that haven't been costed that they plan to build, well, they've done rough costings of them. So they're planning $20 billion spending over 10 years. So, that's obviously a lot of that's just wasted money because it's purely ideological. And then in terms of revenue side, I mean, this government is now giving $2 billion a year extra to the top 10%. That's what their tax cuts meant, is that the top 10% are $2 billion a year better off. And that means that the government goes into debt. So, we're borrowing money in order to pay for tax cuts that went to the very highest income earners. It's obscene in a way.
So we'd be a whole lot better off if that $2 billion went back into the government coffers?
Yeah, I mean, the government would be going into surplus much earlier if they actually didn't give away very large amounts of money to the wealthiest people in the country.
Okay, finally, Pharmac. Tell us about what's going on with Pharmac and why you guys are so concerned.
Well, Pharmac's the bulk buying agency for pharmaceuticals and medical devices for New Zealand, and so they're able to get good deals because they basically screw the drug companies as best they can because they're a big purchaser, and they use generics. So once the patent comes off a drug, you can get your paracetamol instead of your Panadol, if you like.
Right.
That's a generic of the drug. And so Pharmac does that a lot. Now, the drug companies just hate it and see Pharmac as a real problem because it presents an alternative way to purchase drugs. I mean, it means New Zealand has much, much cheaper drugs than the United States, legal drugs. Anyway, so TPP, what they're trying to do with TPP is to try to stop that and make it much harder for Pharmac to do its business. So they're using this trade negotiation to change the way that Pharmac works to make it much harder. So that's the danger. So
drug dealers would be a whole lot better off if we had a Pharmac for illegal drugs. Is that what you're saying?
Well, drug purchasers perhaps would be
better off. Yeah. Okay, so there's a lot of pressure coming from the United States for this free trade agreement, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, so, Labor and National have got this obsession with these free trade agreements at any cost, and so they've signed up to all sorts of stupid things, and this is the latest one. So the United States negotiates very hard. It says if you want a minuscule access to your agricultural products, then you're going to have to do something about Pharmac. This happened to Australia when they did the trade deal between Australia and the United States. The United States changed the rules around their pharmaceutical benefit scheme, which is similar to our Pharmac.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, thanks very much for your time, Russell. Cheers for that.
Okay. Cheers, mate.
Russell Norman, co-leader of the Greens, there joining us.